Thank you for joining us. Let's see, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon, joining you from my office at Behringer-Crawford Museum. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's history museum, that would not be possible without support. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralphie Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you're not a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. We would love to hear from our viewers tonight. So if you have a question or comment to share, please type it in the chat or the Q&A feature, and I'll be sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. Let's meet tonight's presenter. Stuart Sanders is the author of 5 books, including Perryville Under Fire, The Aftermath of Kentucky's Largest Civil War Battle, The Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, Maney's Confederate Brigade at the Battle of Perryville, Murder on the Ohio Belle, and Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. He has written for a wide range of magazines, journals, and anthologies, and his guest columns about Kentucky history have appeared in more than 50 newspapers across the region. He is the former executive director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association and now serves as the director of research and publications for the Kentucky Historical Society. So thank you so much for joining us, Stuart. So before we get started, there is a quiz question tonight. So the first respondent to enter the correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live will win a Northern Kentucky History Hour prize, and most importantly, bragging rights. So tonight's question is, when pistols were used in a duel, what was the typical distance between the two duelists? So go ahead and get those answers in the chat. And then Stuart, if you're ready, we can go ahead and get started.
Sounds great. Well, Mary Jane, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will work. All right. All right, is that working?
Looks good.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me here. I'm a huge fan of the Behringer-Crawford Museum, and I've known Lori Rich a long time, for example, and I've been there multiple times over the years, and I've always been impressed with the great services that the museum provides, not only to Northern Kentucky, but also the broader region. So it's fun to be here. But tonight, I'm going to be speaking about my new book, which is Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. And at its core, this book really looks at the secession crisis, the Civil War, and how violence changed in Kentucky through the lens of a duel that was fought in 1862 between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian. So I'll be talking about that tonight. On May 6, 1862, Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalf, who's pictured here on the right side of the screen, left a hotel in Maysville, Kentucky after giving a political speech. He'd been at a political meeting, and he was a well-known Unionist in that region around Maysville. He was from Carlisle originally. He was the son of Kentucky Governor Thomas Metcalf, and was really known in the area for being one of the earlier people to enlist to support the Union cause. And at the time, Maysville was a small town on the Ohio River with a population of about 3,500 people. And during the early stages of the Civil War, Maysville had been really an important location where Union firearms, which are called Lincoln guns, were shipped into the state. They were shipped into Maysville and then were sent out around central Kentucky and northern Kentucky. Shortly thereafter, a Union recruiting camp was established near Maysville, and the area quickly became a strategic point in Kentucky for the Union. And that's one reason Leonidas Metcalf spent so much time in that town. As Colonel Metcalf left this political meeting at the local hotel, a resident named Isaac Nelson appeared and sort of abruptly handed Metcalf a note. And Colonel Metcalf opened it up, and the note read, "Sir, having done me a great wrong under circumstances accompanying indignity with outrage, you cannot refuse that which is the object of this note to demand, the satisfaction due from one gentleman to another. My friend, Mr. Isaac Nelson, is authorized to arrange the terms of our meeting." And it was signed, "Respectfully, W.T. Casto." It was signed by William T. Casto, who's pictured here on the left side of the screen. Now, Metcalf did not recognize Casto's name at all, but soon he would end up fighting a duel with Casto and would certainly remember him for the rest of his life, as the two men essentially made a small spot along the Ohio River a dueling ground and sort of lived out their own personal battle, personal Civil War battle on this dueling ground using Colt revolving rifles standing 60 yards apart. So how did this duel come about? We're all familiar with the Burr-Hamilton duel, and but is why is it, when the Civil War was raging, did these two men, one a Union colonel, the other a pro-Confederate civilian, end up fighting their own battle on a dueling ground? And really, the answer lies in the Union arrest of pro-Confederate civilians during the early stages of the Civil War. And by September of 1861, Union authorities in Kentucky were really working to consolidate their power across the state. One way they did this was by arresting typically men who were seen as being pro-Confederate. In addition to arresting newspaper editors and telegraph operators and politicians, Union authorities really worked to kind of quell secessionist sympathies in the state by arresting as many prominent residents as they could who supported the South and then shipping them off to northern prisons. And one of those prisons was here, Fort Lafayette, which was in New York Harbor. And when you look at these arrests, you sort of have to think of it like a Civil War version of a scared straight program or sort of shock probation. Essentially, Union authorities arrested these men in order to terrify them into compliance. And they were sent to places like Camp Chase in Ohio, or Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, or Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. And again, that's pictured here. Really, Union authorities had no intention of keeping these men. Again, as I mentioned, it was sort of more like shock probation, where these guys were typically held for several months in miserable conditions and were then offered their freedom if they took a Union oath of allegiance, which most of them did. And so again, places like Fort Lafayette were, dank, small prison cells with moisture seething through the walls. They were sleeping on, small mattresses stuffed with straw, were given really poor rations. And the idea was to try to break these men and sort of, scare the Confederate out of them, so to speak. And typically most of these men did take the Union loyalty oath. And so among the people who were arrested, as I said, it was typically tend to be more middling people, but on occasion they were able to snag more prominent secessionists. And pictured here is James B. Clay, who was the son of Henry Clay, the noted Kentucky politician. And Clay was one of the men who was snagged in a Union dragnet and arrested for being pro-Confederate. And he was on his way south with several men armed to the teeth. And it was presumed that he was going to join the Confederate Army, so he was arrested by Union authorities. He was taken back to his hometown of Lexington, where he was paraded through the streets in chains, basically as a way to show Lexington residents, hey, if you're a pro-Confederate resident here, if we can grab Henry Clay's son and arrest him, we can essentially grab anyone. So that's one reason they wanted to snag these more prominent politicians. And James B. Clay got caught up in that. He was taken to a Union recruiting ground in Garrett County, Kentucky, where he was roughed up quite a bit. He was eventually sent to Louisville, where Union authorities really wanted him sent quickly northward to a Union prison to avoid any writs of habeas corpus that would demand a hearing or a trial. However, he got in front of a judge pretty quickly, and the judge sort of allowed him to bail himself out or post a bond of about $10,000. So he was able to get free, much to the ire of a lot of Unionists in Kentucky. So James Clay essentially slipped away, but other more prominent Kentuckians fell into the grasp of Union authorities. It included a former governor, Charles S. Moorhead, who'd been governor in the 1850s. Moorhead, who was sort of called a white feather unionist once because he had sort of shifting political ideals during that period. He was arrested and sent to Camp Chase, then Fort Warren and Boston Harbor. Eventually released. Well, he refused to take the Union loyalty oath because he knew that if he did, Confederate authorities would confiscate a massive plantation that he owned in Mississippi that included close to 200 enslaved African Americans. So he was very wary to take the Union loyalty oath, even though he may have, sided with the Union sometimes. But they eventually sort of threw him out of the prison without having to take the oath. And Moorhead eventually fled to Canada, where he remained for the remainder of the Civil War. Union newspaper editors were also snagged. One was Reuben Durrett from Louisville, who was picked up at the same time Governor Charles Moorhead was. So it gives you an idea of the men who were actually arrested during this period. You know, some were much more prominent. And the reason the duel happened between Leonidas Metcalf, again the Union colonel, and William T. Casto is because Metcalf, who ultimately dueled Casto, really took part in these arrests and actually arrested Casto. So what happened was on October 2nd, 1861, Union General Bull Nelson, who's pictured here, ordered Metcalf to arrest 7 men from Maysville who were essentially pro-Confederate, and that included William T. Casto. Nelson did this because he was going to march his troops into eastern Kentucky as a way to try to clear that region out of any Confederate soldiers who were down there. And it's called the Big Sandy Campaign in the Big Sandy River Valley. And he wanted to essentially get all the Confederates out of Maysville to essentially protect his rear as he marched down into eastern Kentucky. So why arrest Casto? He was sort of a grocer's son. He was a well-off attorney who really didn't need to work. It was said that while other lawyers in Maysville spent their time in the legal bar, Casto spent all his time in the bar of a local tavern. That was sort of a local joke about him. Casto was mayor for a really brief time in Maysville, but he had supposedly made Union authorities, including Bull Nelson, angry by arguing with them and threatening them. It was also said that when Union recruiting camps were established in Maysville, that he ended up supporting Confederate recruits in the area and sort of helping outfit Confederate soldiers. Other men who were arrested by Metcalf along with Casto included a former U.S. congressman named Richard Stanton, who was a lawyer in Maysville. Bull Nelson, again pictured here, called Congressman Stanton, or former Congressman Stanton, quote, the soul of the rebellion in this part of Kentucky. So the Unionists in the area knew who the Confederates were, and that included Richard Stanton and several other prominent attorneys, a newspaper editor, and other businessmen in that area. So Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalf led the troops and ended up arresting those Maysville secessionists. All of the men who were arrested ended up being imprisoned in Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, or Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor, again, which is pictured here. And that's where Casto and the others ended up spending several months as Union authorities tried to have them take the Union oath of allegiance. Again, they wanted to sort of scare them straight. They had no intention of keeping men like Casto. They just wanted to, essentially threaten them with long-term imprisonment, make them take the Union loyalty oath, and then send them home. But after sitting in these dank prison cells for several months, most of the Maysville men ended up taking that Union loyalty oath and were released. However, Casto, again, who's pictured here on the left, he refused to take the Union loyalty oath. As his fellow prisoners ended up taking the oath and left, instead, Casto really stayed in jail, sort of brooding and really ruminating about getting revenge on the people he thought had wronged him. He was an attorney. He felt that his constitutional rights had been violated by being spirited off to Union prisons without any sort of trial or hearing, and he was determined that he would have his day in court. So he refused to take that oath and wanted, again, Union authorities to admit that they had wronged him. However, his refusal to take the oath ultimately frustrated Union authorities, and basically Casto was eventually released without having to take the oath. They sort of kicked him out eventually. Once Bull Nelson's campaign in the Big Sandy Valley was successful, they knew they didn't have to worry about any Confederates behind Union lines, so they ended up basically kicking Casto out of jail and sent him back to Maysville. When he returned, he immediately began practicing shooting with rifles and pistols, preparing for a duel. And he basically wanted revenge on the first person he could find who was involved with his arrest. And that ended up being Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalf, the man who led the soldiers who arrested those 7 Maysville men. And since they were both upper-class Kentuckians of means, again, Casto was a well-heeled attorney and sort of a wealthy man who lived on a trust fund, basically, saw himself as a gentleman. Leonidas Metcalf was the son of a Kentucky governor. They're both upper-class Kentuckians. Because of that, Casto would not simply find Metcalf and shoot him on the street. Instead, he would engage in sort of what the code of honor of the time called for and challenged Metcalf to a duel. Again, Metcalf had no memory of arresting Casto, but he, again, had made his name himself as a staunch Unionist. And he accepted that duel because he said he did not want to be browbeaten in the future and that he didn't want to be threatened in the future by any other pro-Confederate. So he wanted to end any threats to his life then and there by dueling with Casto, showing that he had the courage to do so, and curtailing any future attempts on his life or any future challenges to duel. Casto or Metcalf is a really interesting figure because, you know, at the time in Kentucky, most Unionists were actually pro-slavery. They thought that thanks to fugitive slave laws, you know, being on the border of free states, they thought that slavery would be better protected under the U.S. Constitution than out of it. So a lot of Confederates, Unionist Kentuckians were actually pro-slavery too. Metcalf, however, as the war dragged on, sort of took a turn and began vocally blaming enslavers and slavery for being the cause of the Civil War. And this really earned him the ire of a lot of Kentuckians in the region. So the Casto-Metcalf duel really played in Kentucky's own brand of sort of honor culture, as we can call it. So what was honor, and, you know, how did it push men like Casto and Metcalf on to the dueling ground? And, you know, most duels had their roots in this sort of Southern code of honor. To simplify it, the code of honor were really unwritten rules of behavior that regulated how you acted, number one, but more importantly, it also showed how your community viewed you. So above all, those who followed the code of honor really worked to avoid embarrassment or public shame. So if someone from the same social class insulted you or cheated you, you might issue a challenge to duel in order to protect your reputation. And if you were challenged to duel, you wanted to show that you weren't a coward. You wanted to avoid that public shame of being a coward. So you would typically accept that duel to kind of protect that reputation. You know, you could be shunned, for example, if you didn't duel. And, you know, that could ruin your business. It could ruin your personal relationships. So it was a very serious matter among these upper class Kentuckians if they were challenged to follow that code of honor. You know, it was very imperative, as one historian wrote, quote, to affirm one's worth publicly and to resist at any cost threats to that reputation. So if honor was maligned by either insults, social slights, political squabbles, failed business deals, I mean, the list can go on, blue-blooded Kentuckians could solve that affront by fighting a formal, structured duel. And we know that, you know, a good number of prominent Kentuckians, from Henry Clay, Cassius Marcellus Clay, John Rowan, who lived in what is now my old Kentucky home in Bardstown, and others, all fought duels in order to maintain their reputations. And basically, among these men, their personal reputations mattered more than any legal consequences that they could encounter that were meant to curtail dueling. It was illegal. Kentucky laws as early as 1799 forbade the practice of dueling, and anyone who was convicted of giving a challenge to duel, acting as a second, or fighting a duel, was basically banned from holding any state office for 7 years. And all public officials, you know, had to raise their right hand and publicly affirm and swear that they had never participated in a duel or acted as a second, never been involved with any affairs of honor. And the fun part is that oath still exists in today. And so if you're from the governor down to, for example, board members of the Kentucky Historical Society, board members of public libraries who are sort of politically appointed, all of those attorneys, if they're, you know, getting their law license in Kentucky, all have to swear that they've never dueled, which I think is a great sort of piece of our history that we still have active today. And so some of you out there may have either had to take this oath or may have heard it administered. You know, sort of elicits a chuckle now from audience members. But what you have to remember is that at a time when Kentuckians were really trying to dissuade people from upper class men from dueling, you know, they did this as a way to hope that political ambitions would outweigh that sort of personal sense of honor. And many times this did not happen, as you can imagine. So again, the laws did little to dissuade many upper class Kentuckians from dueling. And basically, when men like Henry Clay, these prominent Kentuckians, ended up fighting, as you can imagine, it sort of put a public stamp of approval on dueling. Prosecutors rarely, you know, brought charges against duelists. Even if a man was killed in a duel, you know, the man who shot him was rarely charged with murder. So the practice essentially became a form of regulated, community-sanctioned violence, and it was a socially accepted way to resolve conflict in Kentucky during much of the 19th century. It was also said that dueling may have become more popular because of laws that forbade the practice. Some historians have argued that the southernness of the duel also made young, sort of hot-blooded Southerners want to duel more. And again, since prominent politicians were dueling too, in Kentucky, the lax attitude that the state had toward dueling in general was pretty well known. This prompted one man who was going to fight a duel out of state. He later said about his future opponent, quote, "I wish I had him in Kentucky that I might kill the dog without the trouble of fighting him." So again, Kentucky's reputation is sort of turning a blind eye to dueling or public violence in general was alive and well during the 19th century. So some of the prominent men who dueled in Kentucky included some of the most prominent citizens, of course. Um, Henry Clay, pictured here, ironically known as the Great Compromiser, found himself on the dueling ground a couple of times. In 1807, he dueled with Humphrey Marshall, who's a fellow state legislator. They were both in the General Assembly at the time. Tensions were high with Great Britain. Again, this is just sort of shortly before the War of 1812. And Clay had issued a proposal that Kentuckians should only purchase clothing that was domestically made. Humphrey Marshall, again, a fellow legislator who's also a former U.S. congressman, called Clay's idea, quote, "the claptrap of a demagogue," which, I wish they would, throw insults like that out to political opponents today. But alas, it is not to be. But again, Clay called speaking with the claptrap of a demagogue, was insulted. He challenged Humphrey Marshall to duel. They fought near Louisville with pistols. Although both men missed twice, again, they kept the duel going, even though they missed the first two times. On the third fire, Marshall shot Clay in the leg, giving him a minor wound. This, of course, was not Clay's only duel. In 1826, while he was a U.S. senator, Clay's was called a cross between the Puritan and the blackleg, meaning he was a swindler, by a U.S. senator named John Randolph. And they fought outside of Washington. They exchanged fire multiple times. And then finally, on the, I think it was probably the third shot, Clay fired and missed. And then his opponent, John Randolph, again, a U.S. senator, just simply raised his pistol in the air, fired and intentionally missed Clay. And that was a gesture that really impressed Clay. And the two men reconciled and eventually became friends. But the site of dueling grounds have also found to be pretty interesting in Kentucky. In Lexington, where the horse park is now, that was a noted dueling ground. I think there were at least 5 duels fought there. One between 2 doctors who fought a duel. They'd argued over a post-mortem examination of all things. One doctor shot the other one, shot him in a leg artery, and then stepped in and basically saved his opponent's life. Also in I think it was 1852, 2 students from Transylvania University in Lexington fought a duel on that same farm. And they fought with shotguns loaded with slugs at 40 yards, and one student killed the other. And the reason this farm became a noted dueling ground is because it was located on the Scott County, Fayette County line. And they would duel a lot on county lines because it was difficult to determine who had prosecutorial jurisdiction. And so, again, it gave another excuse for authorities to turn a blind eye to dueling, if you could fight at that time. So, again, by the time of the Civil War, the idea of fighting a formal duel had become pretty foreign to Kentuckians because, at the time, Civil War soldiers were killing each other in droves on battlefields. So in April of 1862, for example, just a month before Castro and Metcalf dueled up near Maysville, more than 23,000 men were killed and wounded at the Battle of Shiloh, fought down in Tennessee. So, again, the idea of fighting a formal structured duel at a time when these massive battles were happening became sort of a foreign concept to a lot of Kentuckians. And it's one thing that got dueling eventually out of style. However, though, Castro and Metcalf found their way, despite these massive casualties, made their way to the dueling ground because Castro believed that his honor had been impugned, that he'd been deeply and grossly insulted when he was arrested without charges or trial. And again, to cleanse that honor or that stain on his honor, he ended up challenging Metcalf to duel. And Metcalf accepted because, again, he didn't want to face future threats. He wanted to end things once and for all. So even though the idea of fighting a duel during the Civil War while soldiers were killing each other on battlefields seems pretty like even more crazy than a typical duel, there were other duels that were fought by Civil War soldiers. One example is George Earl Maney, who's pictured here. And my third book looks at Maney's brigade at Perryville. And after the Battle of Perryville, a doctor in Nashville ended up accusing Maney of being a coward during the battle. And since Maney's regiment, some of them had suffered about 50% casualties at the Battle of Perryville, which is a huge number. Maney challenged the doctor to a duel, and even though details are scant, it looks like that Maney ended up wounding that doctor. John Marmaduke and Lucius Walker. This is Marmaduke pictured here. Both of them were Confederate generals. They fought a duel near Little Rock, Arkansas in 1863. And the root of that duel, the two men did not like each other. And after Civil War battles, they would accuse one another of not supporting each other with their troops. And tension existed between the two men. Eventually, Marmaduke inferred that Walker was a coward, and they fought with pistols on the dueling ground. Fought with 6-shot Colt Navy revolvers at 15 paces, which is basically 45 feet. And in that fight, Marmaduke killed Walker. And although Marmaduke was charged with murder, again, since dueling was sort of seen as being somewhat socially acceptable in the South, charges were eventually dropped. And again, this whole notion of honor outweighing any personal consequences happened throughout the Civil War, as men like Marmaduke kill Walker in the fight. So typically, pistols were the weapon chosen for duels, and it was typically pistols at 10 paces or about 30 feet were used in duels. But rifles were used, knives were used, other weapons were chosen. And interestingly enough, when Abraham Lincoln lived in Illinois, the state auditor of Illinois challenged Lincoln to duel. There'd been a number of newspaper articles written disparaging this auditor, the state auditor, and the auditor eventually figured out it was Lincoln who was probably writing them, and he challenged Lincoln. And the way the duels worked, if I challenged you to duel, you would then, as the challenge party, get to pick the time, the place of the duel, and also the weapons to be used. So if you were challenged by someone, you at least had that sort of advantage where you got to pick the weapon. And Lincoln, who had honed his strength swinging an axe on the Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois frontiers, ended up when this sort of diminutive state auditor challenged him to duel, Lincoln actually chose broadswords, and the smaller auditor wisely demurred and sort of eventually put the duel off, and it never happened. And Lincoln later claimed, he said, I would have cut the man in two if they had dueled. So one wonders, would Honest Abe have become president if he'd actually killed the Illinois state auditor in the years before the Civil War? So sort of a what if of history. In Kentucky, he hardly got any votes. In Lexington, the home of his Todd-in-laws, Lincoln only got 5 votes in the 1860 election. So one wonders, probably in Kentucky, he would have gotten more votes if he had actually fought a duel. But we shall never know. But Lincoln, of course, was elected. So back to the Casto-Metcalf duel and their fight along the Ohio River in 1862. And on May 8th, 1862, just 2 days after the challenge was issued, Casto and Metcalf fought their duel on the fishing shore on the Ohio River outside of Dover, Kentucky, which is just next to Maysville. And again, Metcalf accepted because he didn't want to be browbeaten. He wanted to sort of curtail future threats. And as one Dover resident put it, he said, mutual friends made an effort to reconcile the political antagonists, but a fight alone could heal the wounded honor of one and preserve its integrity in the other. So that's why the duel was fought. And as the challenge party, Colonel Metcalf, the Union colonel, chose rifles at 60 yards. And Casto's negotiators initially sort of balked at the idea. They knew that Metcalf was a good rifle shot, but eventually they all settled on fighting with Colt revolving rifles loaded with 1 round at 60 yards. And so this picture here, which was used for the cover of the book that I wrote, Anatomy of a Duel, actually shows a Colt revolving rifle. So fairly, it was a 56 caliber rifle, a large round, and this is what they ended up dueling at the time, or using it for the duel at the time. And although they really tried to keep the duel secret, word leaked out. It was illegal. You didn't want a lot of people as witnesses, but a crowd of a few hundred people actually showed up to watch this duel unfold. And initially, sort of the atmosphere was pretty jovial. Casto and his friends showed up down the Ohio River on a steamboat, took a steamboat down to the dueling ground, while Metcalf showed up in a carriage with a bunch of his friends. And to show how confident Metcalf was, again, the Union colonel, he ended up taking a nap on the shore of the Ohio River while his opponent Casto was off practicing with his rifle. Metcalf got up once and ended up shooting a pocket knife that was stuck into a stump from 60 yards away. So as you can imagine, it was Metcalf had a very good advantage. And I won't ruin the story for anyone who wants to read the book, so I won't sort of tell you the result of this fight. But you can imagine if Metcalf is hitting a pocket knife at 60 yards, suffice it to say that one shooter called his shot, said he would shoot the opponent through his right breast pocket, and he ended up doing that. So one man walked away with his reputation intact, and the other one lay dead on the shore of the Ohio River. And again, it's probably pretty clear who won that duel, but I will leave it a bit of a mystery to anyone who wants to read the book. To me, this duel is important because it was one of the last duels fought in Kentucky under the Code Duello, which is the sort of former rules of the duel. There were sort of a handful of other duels. In 1866, for example, a former Union soldier and an ex-Confederate fought a duel on that famous dueling ground in Lexington, that's now the Kentucky Horse Park. They fought with pistols. They actually used Henry Clay's dueling pistols at the time. Again, it was in 1866. The two men had been antagonists since they were schoolboys together in Paris before the Civil War. Again, one ended up going into the Confederate Army. Joe Deshay was his name. The other one ended up becoming a Union sergeant. Both men really emerged from the war just shattered. And this is interesting because it's another sort of duel with its roots a little bit in the Civil War. Deshay, again, the former Confederate, had been wounded multiple times, including getting clipped in the head by a cannonball at the Battle of Stones River in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He was wounded several more times. He got a terrible arm wound at the Battle of Chickamauga, pictured here. And then his left arm was badly shattered toward the end of the war at Dallas, Georgia. His future antagonist, Alexander Kimbrough, again became a Union sergeant, and he didn't fare much better during the war. Here again at Chickamauga, he was severely wounded where he had his right leg fractured. So again, you have these two broken veterans in 1866 who had this sort of schoolboy antagonism toward one another. They met at a local tavern. One man extended his hand to sort of try to make up. The other refused. They got in a fist fight. Again, these two badly shattered Civil War veterans, again, pummeling one another. One actually picked up a chair and hit the other man with it. But they ended up, again, it ended up becoming a duel. They felt that their honor had been impugned. So they used Henry Clay's pistol on that famous dueling ground. Again, they fought pistols 30 feet, the typical distance. And they used these flintlocks. They missed on the first fire. They were still so furious one another. They loaded and shot again. And on the second shot, Kimbrough, the Union veteran, shot through Deshay's coat pocket. Deshay was much more accurate, and he shot Kimbrough, and the round actually went through both of Kimbrough's hips, went in one side and exited the other. Terribly painful wound. And poor Kimbrough had already had a shattered right leg from this battle at Chickamauga, became terribly wounded again through this duel. Both men ended up surviving, but Kimbrough spent the remainder of his life sort of being shuttled from one Union veteran's home to another. Because the duel was illegal, Deshay and his second was the man who sort of helped organize and negotiate the duel. They ended up fleeing to Canada to avoid prosecution, stayed there for 10 years. And finally, again, around 1876, Kentucky Governor James McCreary, who was a former Confederate soldier who probably knew Deshay, ended up pardoning him. And Deshay returned to Kentucky and became a famous horse breeder. So the duel between Casso and Metcalf wasn't the last duel fought in Kentucky, but to me, it shows an important pivot point that shows how the application of violence really changed in Kentucky after the Civil War. Because after the Civil War, again, this notion of fighting a formal duel became sort of ridiculous to Kentuckians. However, that honor culture remained where, Kentuckians were sort of prone to take insult. And instead, they sort of deregulated violence, took it off the dueling ground and onto the streets. Kentuckians during the late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, on into the 1920s and 30s, all began carrying concealed weapons very frequently. And instead of writing challenges to duel and negotiating a formal duel, instead these Kentuckians just sort of pulled pistols on the street when they saw one another and began firing. It's really staggering how many shootouts took place in Kentucky after the Civil War. I mean, doing a historic newspaper search, Just type in affray, A-F-F-R-A-Y, or pistol affray or knife affray. You'll literally get dozens and dozens of hits of these upper-class Kentuckians fighting one another. And this is something that really sort of made Kentucky's reputation decline after the Civil War. I mean, the New York Times was constantly running newspaper articles talking about, a day's accounting of violence in Kentucky that would include, 20 or 30 incidences of fairly public violence, everything from bushwhackings and feuds in Eastern Kentucky to, shootings in Central Kentucky to murders in Western Kentucky. I mean, the list goes on and on. There were, to give you a couple quick examples of this type of violence, in 1887, when a statue of John C. Breckinridge was dedicated in Lexington, Kentucky, there was a crowd of thousands of people in downtown Lexington. Thomas Marshall Green, a newspaper editor, had gotten in a public squabble with a man named Lou Baldwin, who was a county court clerk in Nicholasville. Green, the newspaper man, had accused Baldwin of some corruption. And when they saw each other in front of the Phoenix Hotel in downtown Lexington, they immediately pulled pistols. And Green ended up killing Baldwin, leaving a wife, leaving his widow to raise their 5 children alone. And Green was released, was charged with murder, but was released on grounds that he had protected himself, self-defense, by reason of self-defense. And that was a typical defense in courts in Kentucky after the war, and they were typically successful. If your opponent was armed at all, you usually didn't have to worry that you would be locked up after killing someone on the street, unfortunately. Another example of two sort of upper class Kentuckians fighting during this period was in 1889, also in Lexington. 2 Republican Party operatives, one named Armistead Swope, the other named William C. Goodloe, hated each other. And of course, as luck would have it, their post office boxes, one was right on top of the other. And one man was getting the mail, the other sort of came up to get his mail. They had an argument, and a fight broke out. Goodloe carried a knife, Swope had a pistol, and the 2 men grabbed one another, were sort of spun around the Lexington post office fighting. Swope ended up shooting Goodloe, and Goodloe stabbed Swope 13 times. And basically, both men killed each other in this very public fight in Lexington in 1889. So again, this propensity for quick, hair-triggered violence among upper-class Kentuckians sort of doomed the state's reputation. And again, as you can imagine, feuds in Eastern Kentucky did that as well. We were no longer seen as being sort of the erudite land of compromisers like Henry Clay and John J. Crittenden. Instead, we got this reputation for violence. It wasn't helped in 1900 when Governor William Goebel, who you all are familiar with in Covington, of course, was killed on the grounds of what is now the old state capitol in 1900. Goebel also, you all probably know this, he also participated in his own sort of personal violence in 1895, just 5 years before he became governor. He actually shot and killed a bank cashier in a bank in Covington while Goebel was standing right next to the state's attorney general. And again, he was also charged, but was acquitted by reason of self-defense. So again, as crazy as that sounds, he's standing next to, Goebel is standing next to Kentucky's attorney general, sees this bank cashier. Both men pull pistols. Goebel shoots the cashier in the head and kills him. They claim self-defense, and he was released and became governor 5 years later, but again, met his own sad end thanks to an assassin's bullet. So in my latest book, Anatomy of a Duel, I examined sort of the secession crisis, and again, how violence really changed in the state through the lens of the Casto-Metcalf duel. And again, for me, the Casto-Metcalf duel really serves as an important pivot point when dueling fell out of fashion among the upper classes, and Southern honor still remained strong in the state. And instead of fighting these formal duels, Kentuckians ended up engaging in spontaneous street fights. So again, this book looks at the causes and the long-term consequences of this duel between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian who turned the grounds along the Ohio River into their own personal battlefield during the nation's greatest conflict. So thanks for having me. And I'd be certainly happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stuart. And we did have some questions and some comments. So the first one I have is from Jason. He said, as a graduate from EKU, would love to learn more about his significance to his Eastern Kentucky presence. Is there a connection with Clay's Ferry?
A connection with dueling to Clay's Ferry? I'm sorry, is that the
Yeah, I
or
believe
learn
Henry
whose connection
Clay.
to Clay's Ferry? Henry, I'm not sure about that actually. I'm sure that that he's related. There's probably a historical marker about Clay's Ferry, I would bet. But I don't live in Lexington, so I'm not sure about that sort of local history. But I'd encourage you, you know, if the Kentucky Historical Society is a historical marker database, you could probably find a marker about Clay's Ferry there that would sort of tell you more about it. But you know, there were a number of members of the Clay family around. You know, in Richmond, for example, Cassius Marcellus Clay, who's the noted anti-slavery advocate during the 19th century, became Lincoln's minister to Russia. He lived in Richmond, so it may have probably a deeper connection to Cassius Marcellus Clay. And Cash Clay fought his own duels. He had several duels and also knife fights. He was attacked while giving anti-slavery speeches. So he's another interesting figure who was sort of marred by widespread violence in Kentucky in the years sort of before and after the Civil War.
And it looks like we have a friend of yours, Andrew McNeil. He
Yeah.
said,
Hey,
presentation,
Andrew.
old friend. He's
Hey,
only
good to
a
see you.
few chapters into the book, but he's really impressed with your primary sources, especially giving details about Maysville, Mason County during the period. He said, can you talk a little about your research methods to get to primary sources in Kentucky?
Right. Yeah. This duel, you know, researching duels is sort of tricky because uh, the duelists did not want to go to prison or be charged or lose their law licenses. And first of all, Andrew, thanks for being here tonight. Uh, we'll have to grab lunch soon, sometime in Frankfurt, of course. But you know, since they wanted to keep duels quiet, primary sources are sometimes hard to find. So I was fortunate that there was a resident from Dover, Kentucky, who'd written a letter to an editor, sort of describing what transpired with this duel. I also found some resources at the Filson Historical Society. One of my favorites was I found a pledge there that a number of Kentuckians had signed, pledging that they would not fight a duel. And one of the men actually added a little caveat, and he basically wrote, I will not duel except under very extreme circumstances. So he's sort of this fair weather signatory. So there are a lot of good resources out there about dueling, and they're just sort of sometimes hard to find. But for this particular project, you know, I was able to find a couple of letters to the editor and other newspaper articles that did a good job sort of describing the duel. I spent some time talking about arrests that transpired in Kentucky. You know, again, the duel was sort of sparked by the secession crisis. And so there are a lot of official records that talk about these arrests and the number of Kentuckians who were confined in out-of-state prisons before the war, which again sort of sparked that. But Andrew, I appreciate you reading the book, and I hope to see you soon. So thanks for being here.
And then we also had someone comment that Senator Goebel was shot, not Governor Goebel, because I guess he was not.
Touche. Yeah, good point.
And I thought it was interesting about, you said that today still people swear to never taking a duel.
Right.
So I thought that was very interesting.
It's still the oath, which is fun.
Have you ever taken that oath?
You know, I have not actually. That's a good, and I think jurors may have to take it too if you're sworn in as a juror. And so I wonder, you know, would this be a way to get out of jury duty? Claim that you've dueled. I don't know, but I've not taken it yet. So, but my wife's an attorney. She's taken it a few times.
Okay. Well, that was an excellent presentation. I don't see any other questions or comments right now. If anybody has one, go ahead and leave them in here. I do want to say I did not we had a winner for the quiz question. I did not skip that. So let's see. Our quiz question again was, when pistols were used in a duel, what was the typical distance between the two duelists? And the answer was 10 paces or 30 feet. So the winners were Cindy and Woody Schuster.
Great.
So congratulations to them. And then Miss Lori has a comment. So Lori, our executive director, said she had to take the oath when she joined the Kentucky Historical Society board.
Now, I would imagine that Lori's probably fought a few duels in her lifetime, so I don't know if she could actually swear that oath or not. But
I also, while Lori's on there, I want to give a shout out to Lori because her birthday is tomorrow. So happy birthday, Lori. And then
happy birthday, Lori.
Mikhail Hopkins said, great job, thank you. And she said your book title. Oh, she wants to know the book titles again.
Yeah, sure. And so I've written 5 books. The first one was called Perryville Under Fire. which it looks at the aftermath of Kentucky's largest Civil War battle at the Battle of Perryville. So it looks at how the town's 300 inhabitants sort of contended with not only the thousands of wounded men, but also thousands of sick soldiers. It looks at how the region of central Kentucky and beyond was affected. I wrote a book about the Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, which is just called the Battle of Mill Springs. I wrote another called Maney's Brigade at the Battle of Perryville, sort of a command study looking at the troops who endured the heaviest fighting on the Union left flank during that battle. And then wrote a book called Murder on the Ohio Belle that examines a murder and the subsequent vigilante justice that took place in 1856 on board a steamboat that traveled from Cincinnati to New Orleans and back. So there's some Northern Kentucky history tied in with that one too, but it looks at sort of this murder and what the consequences of that were. And then again, the latest one that I talked about tonight is called Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. And so I appreciate your interest, and they're all fun to research and also fun to talk about too. So thank you all for having me.
And also, you've been a guest on the program before. I believe you also spoke about Murder on the Ohio Belle. So
I did, yeah. I talked about a couple of years ago. I think it may have been during the pandemic even. The book came out in March 2020. Right when the pandemic hit is when the book came out.
Yeah, it's probably right when we started this program.
Yeah,
and I want everyone to know that we do have all of the recordings can be found at bcmuseum.org. You can find all those, so you could check that out if you're interested. Let's see, we did have another. It said, so Donna wants to know what country started having duels.
Yeah, it emerged somewhere. We think like sort of duels in America at least probably came from Europe. And so we're not sure what European countries sort of brought dueling to the United States, but it was definitely Europeans who sort of exported it here to the United States. And then it became much more of a Southern thing. I mean, there were some duels fought in other states. Two Indiana legislators at the beginning of the Civil War, for example, almost had a duel with Bowie knives, but that never transpired. There were threats of duels in the North, and some duels, again, Hamilton and Burr dueled in New Jersey, for example. But by the time the Civil War rolled around, even the 1850s or so, it was seen as being much more of a Southern thing. One thing I talk about in the book too is how Kentuckians ended up exporting kind of this dueling culture to other states, and so there were a lot of Kentuckians who ended up moving to Missouri, who fought duels in Missouri during the antebellum period. Even some who went out to California and during the gold rush, 1840s, 1850s, ended up fighting duels out there too. And so I think you have this evolution of dueling, comes from Europe, it goes to sort of the East Coast, and then gets spread out to the South, then goes farther west, places like Missouri, then eventually places like California. And it kind of evolves again once sort of 6-shooter pistols became the norm. Kind of dueling evolved into that kind of old West gunfight that we think about. It's more of a Hollywood thing, but that sort of had its roots in dueling too. So that's a great question. It was more of a European concept.
Okay, and I want you to know that we have a lot of people telling you great job.
Well, thanks.
And thanks for the excellent presentation. Great work, very informative, and a great job, Stu, from Andrew.
Hey, thanks, Andrew. It's great. Thank you so much for being on here too. I appreciate it. And thanks for reading the book.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up if we don't have any other questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. Let's see here. And so I just want to remind everyone that the museum is temporarily closed right now for minor repairs and renovations, but we still have outreach programs available during this time. And there's also many volunteer opportunities. So please contact info@bcmuseum.org if you're interested. So the holidays have come to an end, and so have BCM's Holly Jolly Days. But thank you to everyone who has made this season's exhibits and events so great, especially our wonderful sponsors, Kentucky Tourism, Arts and Heritage Cabinet, DeVia Good Foundation, Milburn Family, Renewal by Anderson, Schneller Knockelman Plumbing, Heating and Air, Earl Frank's Sons and Daughters, and RDG. So the museum may be closed, but we have many great virtual presentations lined up. So January 23rd, we have the Kelly Cote, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, X-Ray Manufacturing Company with presenter John Belle. We have Coney Island Unveiled with Heather Churchman on February 6th, and A Tradition Reborn with Bob Webster on February 20th. So please be sure to tune in to those. For more Northern Kentucky history throughout the week, check out our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, where you can find the latest Curators Chat, along with all of our past Northern Kentucky History Hour presentations. Please like and subscribe. That's all that we have time for this evening. So thank you again to all of the sponsors and supporters of BCM. And especially thank you so much, Stuart, for a great presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, everyone, take care and good night.